Genesis 50, verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. This example is such an incredible example of what true forgiveness is and what it is that God requires. And I just want us to take a minute to think about what all Joseph had gone through. He was sold into slavery. Then he found himself in a situation where the wife of his master is accusing him of trying to seduce her. He just went through so much, to make no mention of the fact that he was ripped from his family and his home and his father. Now his father is dead. He would have had a decent reason, by the standards of the world, not by the standards of God, to have held a resentment over them and to have, tried to vindicate himself with them. He would have had, by the world's standards, a good reason to be able to do that. But that's not what he chose to do. And it's not how God moved him. I don't think I'm going to make this a very long video because there's only one thing to really say, and the rest needs to just be done in your heart. I want you guys to think about who you're struggling to forgive. And I want you to take Genesis 50, verse 19 through 21, and move your heart into that position. And the way that you move it is not just to make a decision. You're going to have to write out the feelings that you have about that situation, and you're going to have to take it to God. Use the work that I've taught you in Heart Known series. Sort this through with yourself as much as you can. That's your personal accountability work. And then take it to God. And if you have done your personal accountability work, God will respond to you. And if you have not, he will not. Because this is a mutual covenant. You don't just go to him and tell him to move your heart into position. You have to do the work. Here's the posture. Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God?" So what does God tell us? Don't judge. You don't get to judge another person's condition or situation. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me. And by the way, they did. But God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. There is an attitude here that is missing. That's missing in today, in those calling themselves Christian today. And that attitude comes from belief and understanding that God is the one who's sovereign and that nothing has happened in your life without the sovereign hand of God. That includes, as I've shared with you about my own history, having grown up in terrible circumstances, in abusive circumstances, in impossible circumstances. But God is going to take that when you actually receive his ministry and start healing in him, instead of going to idols like therapists and those calling themselves counselors and pastors and all these other things. You have a counselor. The Holy Spirit is your counselor. And when you're speaking with the Holy Spirit, you're going to tell that story in a very different way than you'd be telling a therapist, I can guarantee you. And the response you're going to get from the Holy Spirit is going to be very different from what you would get from a therapist, I guarantee you. He is going to hold you accountable. He's going to show you the sin that resulted from the experiences that you've had. And you're actually going to experience healing because you're going to, and part of that is being able to see how you have done these things. So the sin that you've participated in, and then to look back at those who have sinned against you and to be able to say, there are some situations where I never wanted to do that. And I didn't even realize what I was doing. I don't have the ability to judge this other person. But if you go to therapy, if you go to a counselor, if you go to a pastor, are they going to do that with you? Do they have the power to bring you into that understanding? No, the Holy Spirit does. And so the focus is going to be on cleaning you up and bringing your heart into what God requires rather than some justification in the world and its treatments. And then once you have learned the lesson that God intended to build in you, then he will relent. You're not going to have these things that the world calls flashbacks and all this other stuff. It doesn't mean that certain things aren't still going to be painful. It doesn't mean that you won't remember. But when you're having what the world calls flashbacks, when it feels like your unresolved suffering that the world calls trauma, when it feels like that's attacking you, you need to understand that that's for good reason. The reason you've been handed over to that spirit that is attacking you is because you have turned from God and rejected healing over this. You've rejected receiving his ministry over who you've been. You've rejected receiving his ministry in order to be built through this experience. And yes, most of those experiences he's building you with are painful. What would need to happen in order for you to get to the place where your heart is actually believes this, where your heart is actually professing, am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you. The person who hurt me, I will provide for you. This is not just a sweet story. This is what God expects. Okay, so what is the attitude of Jesus? I mean, if we're supposed to be mimicking Jesus, is this not what he does with those who crucified him, those who fought against him, those who have spoken against him? Is that not what he does? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. I hope that you will use this as a sort of rule in your pocket of where you need to be brought to as you are understanding and working your heart into forgiveness. Jesus says things like, love your enemies, pray for those who harm you, give to those who ask of you. If someone tries to sue you, give them your cloak too. These are the things that he says. It's not easy, but I hope that you'll take the time to do this exercise, to take one situation, at least just one situation. You don't have to sit there and feel overwhelmed over, oh my goodness, there's so many people I need to forgive. Take one situation and allow God to work with you by first doing your own work, journaling out what happened and soothing yourself. Validate your experience, because I want to tell you something else. Like, you can't just make a decision to forgive someone until you've acknowledged your own experience, because then what are you forgiving? You're not even acknowledging what it is that needs to be forgiven or how you've been affected. You have to heal first before you can forgive others. And I think that, or at least what I've observed, is that counterfeit Christianity thinks like, oh, they're lazy. They don't want to have to deal with the ways that things have affected them. And so oftentimes people will say, oh, I've forgiven the person, but they're passive aggressive. They haven't forgiven anything because they haven't dealt with the pain. They refuse to acknowledge it. They want a lazy road to the covenant. And that's just, it's insincere, and it's not going to yield the results, and God's not going to respond to it either. Remember what I told you. He will respond when you've done your work, when you've gone deep enough to do your own work, to acknowledge and examine your feelings, your role, what you've learned in this situation, and then you can go to God and he will transcend what you've done into healing. And he will talk with you about what it is that he's been doing in order to build you. But until you do that, don't expect him to respond. Please take some time to do this. Work your heart into what God requires, and please discern this message with God.